The city below didn't sleep, but the 42nd floor of the Stevens Media Group tower usually did. At midnight, the only sounds were the low, rhythmic hum of the server room 3 floors down, and the faint, settling groan of steel cooling in the night air. The scent of stale coffee from the assistant's bullpen hadn't quite breached the heavy oak doors of the executive suite yet, leaving the air inside crisp, recycled, and perfectly, aggressively neutral. Audrey Stevens stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass, her reflection a ghost against the sprawling grid of Chicago. They called her the Iron Sovereign. She looked the part, tailored charcoal suit, spine straight enough to serve as a plumb line, hands clasped loosely behind her back. She owned the view, but she didn't dare touch it. She didn't touch anything she didn't have to. The distance was the point. Then the door opened. No knock, no hesitant shuffle of an intern terrified to interrupt, just the sharp click of the latch and the intrusion of footsteps that lacked any appropriate deference. Elena Rossi didn't believe in knocking. The air in the room shifted instantly, heavy with an annoyance that felt dangerously, confusingly, like anticipation. To understand the intrusion, you have to understand the fortress. Audrey hadn't just climbed the corporate ladder. She had dismantled it and built an elevator that only she had the code for. Stevens Media wasn't just a publishing house anymore. It was a machine of cultural influence. And Audrey was the mechanic who kept the gears oiled with silence and precision. Her world was built on the absence of friction. When she walked through the open-plan editorial floor, the noise level dropped by decibels. Conversations ceased mid-sentence. Bodies shifted out of her path like water parting for a ship's prow. It wasn't fear, exactly, though there was plenty of that. It was a reverence for the vacuum she created. In her presence, chaos died. She moved through the corridors like a cold front, efficient and inevitable, leaving a trail of straightened ties and hushed voices in her wake. She preferred the cold glass of her office to the warmth of the break room. She preferred the sterile white noise of a perfectly balanced HVAC system to the messy, unpredictable cadence of small talk. Isolation wasn't a punishment for Audrey. It was a strategy. It was the ultimate high ground. From up here, people were data points, trends, and profit margins. They weren't complications. And right now, complications were the one thing she couldn't afford. The merger with Sterling Holloway was weeks away. This wasn't just a business deal. It was a coronation. Absorbing their backlist and digital infrastructure would make Stevens Media the singular dominant force in global publishing. But the Sterling board was skittish. They were old money, conservative, obsessed with stability. They wanted a partner who was as predictable as a Swiss watch. They needed to know that the hand on the tiller wouldn't shake. Audrey had spent 10 years becoming that watch. She had calibrated every aspect of her public and private life to project absolute, unshakable stability. No scandals, no erratic behavior, no partners. That was the key. Intimacy was a variable. It was a wild card that introduced emotional volatility into a system that required logic. Years ago, somewhere between her first VP promotion and the hostile takeover of the board, Audrey had run the numbers. Relationships required vulnerability. Vulnerability created leverage for others. Therefore, relationships were a tactical error. She had excised the need for them with surgical precision. She told herself she didn't miss the warmth of another body or the sound of a voice that wasn't asking for budget approval. She had convinced herself that the cold clarity of power was a superior sensation to the messy heat of desire. She wore her solitude like the silk linings of her blazers, hidden, expensive, and essential to the structure. It kept her sharp. It kept her safe. It kept her winning. Standing at the window, watching the red taillights bleed into the arteries of the highway below, she felt entirely secure in her isolation. Her reflection stared back, cool, composed, impenetrable. The Iron Sovereign, a woman who needed nothing and no one. The silence in the office was a physical weight, a blanket she pulled tight around her shoulders. It was perfect. But the problem with building a life on the exclusion of variables is that the universe abhors a vacuum. You can lock the doors, seal the windows, and filter the air, but eventually something gets in. A draft, a sound, a person who refuses to read the memo on protocol. Audrey checked her watch. 12:03 a.m. The merger documents on her desk were perfect. The strategy was sound, the fortress was secure. Then she heard it. Not the silence she cultivated, but a disruption. A laugh, loud and uninhibited, echoing from the hallway where no one should be. It was a sound that didn't belong in the sterile geometry of her world. It was organic, rough, and entirely too alive. It scraped against the polished veneer of the night. Audrey turned from the window, her brow furrowing. She didn't know it yet, but the equation was about to break. The variable she had spent a decade eliminating was walking down the hall right now, wearing combat boots and carrying a red pen, ready to rewrite the entire narrative. Elena Rossi was the kind of woman who didn't just occupy space. She colonized it with noise and color. She walked into the midnight silence of the executive suite, wearing a vintage leather jacket that had seen more dive bars than boardrooms, her hair a dark, chaotic curl that defied any attempt at professional containment. If Audrey was a distinct, sharp line drawn in archival ink, Elena was a watercolor spill. Messy, expanding, and impossible to contain. She was the new senior acquisitions editor, a brilliant hire from a boutique press in Brooklyn who had been brought in to revitalize the fiction list. Audrey had signed off on the hire based on the numbers. Elena had an uncanny ability to spot bestsellers in the slush pile, but she hadn't accounted for the physical reality of the woman. Elena didn't walk. She strode. She didn't sit. She sprawled. She didn't speak. She projected. The trouble had officially started 10 days ago, during the preliminary strategy session for the Sterling-Halloway merger. The room had been filled with the usual suspects: VPs in gray suits, legal counsel with their yellow pads, and Audrey at the head of the table, conducting the symphony of agreement. The plan was simple: acquire the backlist, trim the midlist, and focus on safe, predictable celebrity memoirs and established franchise thrillers. It was a strategy designed to soothe the anxieties of the investors. Then Elena had spoken. She hadn't raised her hand. She hadn't waited for the Q&A section. She had simply stopped spinning her pen, a cheap plastic blue thing that looked ridiculous against the mahogany table, and said, "So, we're just going to let the soul of the company rot then?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence Audrey usually weaponized, but this time, she wasn't the one holding the trigger. She had looked down the length of the table, expecting to see a flustered junior employee realizing their mistake. Instead, she found Elena Rossi leaning back in her chair, legs crossed, looking directly at Audrey with an expression that was terrifyingly devoid of fear. "Excuse me?" Audrey had said, her voice dropping to that sub-zero register that usually froze dissent in its tracks. "The strategy," Elena said, gesturing vaguely at the projection screen. "It's safe, it's boring. You're buying a legacy house to turn it into a content farm. Sterling-Halloway was built on discovering new voices. If you strip that away to boost the quarterly EBITDA, you're not merging, you're embalming." It wasn't just the insubordination that made Audrey's blood hum. It was the proximity. Elena wasn't using corporate speak. She was speaking with a raw, tactile passion that felt abrasive in the sterile room. She smelled faintly of rain and old paper, a scent that cut through the recycled air of the HVAC system. While everyone else in the room was looking at the data, Elena was looking at Audrey. Not at the CEO, but at the woman behind the podium. Her gaze was heavy, physical. It tracked the movement of Audrey's hands as she organized her notes. It lingered on the tension in Audrey's jaw. For the first time in years, Audrey felt a crack in her composure. It manifested as a physical heat, a flush of irritation that started at her collar and worked its way up. She wanted to dismiss Elena from the room. She wanted to have security escort her out. But she couldn't because Elena was right about the numbers, even if her delivery was disastrous. The fiction list was dying. They needed the fire, but fire burns. Throughout the rest of the meeting, Audrey found her focus fracturing. She would be explaining a synergy projection, and then her eyes would snap back to Elena, who was now sketching on a notepad, her brow furrowed in concentration. The scratching of Elena's pen seemed louder than the projector fan. The vibrant red of her scarf seemed brighter than the charts on the wall. It was a sensory invasion. Audrey's world was grayscale, muted, and controlled. Elena was high-definition noise. Every time Elena shifted in her chair, the leather creaked. Every time she spoke, her voice had a gravelly texture that seemed to vibrate in Audrey's chest. It was infuriating. It was distracting. And worst of all, it made Audrey hyper-aware of her own body, the stiffness of her posture, the shallowness of her breath, the way her own hands were gripping the podium too tightly. She had ended the meeting early, citing a schedule conflict. But the damage was done. The air in the room had changed. It wasn't just a workspace anymore. It was a battlefield, and the enemy wasn't fighting with spreadsheets. She was fighting with presence. Now, standing in the doorway at midnight, Elena brought that same disruptive energy into the sanctuary of the office. She held a stack of proofs in one hand and a takeout container in the other. She didn't apologize for the hour. She didn't apologize for the noise. She just looked at Audrey with that same unnerving, candid assessment, her eyes dark and intelligent, stripping away the title and the suit until Audrey felt dangerously exposed. It wasn't just insubordination. It was a challenge to the very air Audrey breathed. "Spicy basil chicken," Elena announced, dropping the plastic container onto the pristine expanse of Audrey's glass desk. The sound was a dull thud that seemed to echo in the cavernous silence of the room. "I asked for mild. I assumed your palate is as regulated as your schedule, and I didn't want to be responsible for a gastrointestinal crisis during a merger." Audrey stared at the container as if it were a biological hazard. "I didn't order food, Ms. Rossi, and I certainly didn't invite you to turn my office into a cafeteria." "It's Elena," she corrected, pulling a chair around the desk, not to the visitor's side, but right next to Audrey's ergonomic fortress. She sat with a heavy sigh, the leather of her jacket creaking against the silence. "And we have a due diligence report for the Sterling board due in 48 hours. Your current fiction strategy reads like an instruction manual for a toaster. It's competent, dry, and completely devoid of a pulse. We need to fix it, or this merger is going to be the most expensive mistake of your career." Audrey opened her mouth to issue a reprimand, to reestablish the hierarchy, to banish this chaotic element back to the lower floors. But the words died in her throat. Because Elena was right. The strategy was safe, and safe wasn't going to hold the attention of a board looking for a savior. Audrey closed her mouth, adjusted her glasses, and pulled the stack of proofs toward her. 30 minutes, she said, her voice clipped. "Then you leave." 30 minutes turned into 3 hours. The timeline for the merger had compressed like a vice, squeezing the entire executive team. But up here, in the thin air of the penthouse, the pressure was different. It was intimate. As the night deepened, the office ceased to be a symbol of corporate dominance and transformed into a capsule drifting through the dark. The city lights outside blurred into streaks of amber and white, a distant galaxy that felt light years away from the pool of lamplight illuminating the desk. The atmosphere in the room changed. The aggressive neutrality Audrey cultivated was slowly eroded by the sheer force of Elena's existence. The air, usually scrubbed clean, now carried the scent of the basil chicken, the sharp tang of red marker ink, and something else, something warm and musky, like the leather of Elena's jacket and the heat of her skin. It was distracting. It was intoxicating. They worked in a rhythm that Audrey hadn't anticipated. She would analyze the market trends, and Elena would counter with narrative potential. They sparred over titles, over cover art, over the very soul of the backlist. And with every hour that passed, the physical distance between them seemed to shrink. Elena didn't respect the invisible boundaries of personal space. She leaned in to point at a paragraph, her arm brushing within an inch of Audrey's shoulder. She stretched her legs out, her heavy combat boots invading the space under the desk where Audrey's heels usually rested in solitude. She was a constant, vibrant hum of movement, tapping her pen, running a hand through her messy curls, shifting in her chair to look at Audrey with those dark, unblinking eyes. "Do you ever turn it off?" Elena asked suddenly, capping her pen with a sharp click. It was 3 a.m. The silence of the building was heavy, pressing against the glass. Audrey didn't look up from the spreadsheet. "Turn what off?" "The machine," Elena said softly. "The Iron Sovereign routine. Do you ever just exist without calculating the ROI of your next breath?" Audrey stiffened. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. "My routine, as you call it, is the reason 500 people have jobs, Elena. It's the reason you have a job." "I know that," Elena replied, her voice dropping, losing its usual combative edge. She swiveled her chair so she was facing Audrey's profile. "I respect the Empire, Audrey. I really do. But I'm asking about the Emperor. When you go home to that empty apartment I assume you have, what do? Do you have a cat? A plant? A goldfish?" "I have a succulent," Audrey said before she could stop herself. The admission felt absurd, a tiny green vulnerability offered up to the enemy. Elena laughed. It wasn't a mocking sound. It was low and rich, vibrating in the quiet room. "A succulent, of course. Low maintenance, hard to kill, doesn't need to be touched. Very on brand." Audrey turned her head slowly, meeting Elena's gaze. They were sitting 3 feet apart, but in the heavy, charged silence of the early morning, it felt like inches. She could see the fatigue bruising the skin under Elena's eyes, the smudge of ink on her thumb, the way her lips parted slightly as she waited for a response. "It's efficient," Audrey whispered, her voice tighter than she intended. "It's lonely," Elena countered. She didn't look away. Her gaze dropped to Audrey's mouth, then back up to her eyes, heavy with a meaning that had nothing to do with publishing rights. "You can build the highest walls in the world, Audrey, but eventually, you have to come out for air." Audrey felt a tightening in her chest, a physical reaction that had nothing to do with stress and everything to do with the woman sitting beside her. She wanted to lean away, to retreat into the safety of her title, but her body betrayed her. She felt a magnetic pull, a terrifying urge to close that 3-foot gap and see what would happen if the friction finally sparked. "We should finish the report," Audrey said, her voice steady only through sheer force of will. She turned back to the screen, but the numbers blurred. She could still feel Elena's eyes on her, warm and heavy. The walls were still up, but the mortar was beginning to crack. Catastrophe didn't arrive with a scream. It arrived with a soft, polite chime from the tablet on Audrey's desk at 8:43 a.m. The morning sun was cutting through the glass, sharp and unforgiving, illuminating dust motes that usually didn't dare settle in the executive suite. Audrey was reviewing the final merger contracts, her fountain pen hovering over a clause regarding digital rights, when the notification slid across the screen. It was a news alert from a trade publication, followed immediately by 3 more from major financial outlets. Leaked. Stevens Media's scorched earth protocol for Sterling acquisition. Audrey didn't gasp. She didn't drop her pen. She simply set it down, aligning it perfectly parallel to the edge of the desk, and tapped the headline. The document on the screen was familiar. It was a contingency draft she had written 6 months ago, a cold mathematical assessment of Sterling Holloway's assets that outlined a maximum efficiency scenario involving 40% staff reductions and the liquidation of their mid-list literary division. It was a theoretical exercise, a dark mirror strategy she had gamed out to understand the worst-case financial floor. It was never meant to be policy. It was certainly never meant to be public. But in the black and white text on the screen, stripped of context, it didn't look like a theory. It looked like a butcher's bill. It painted her not just as the Iron Sovereign, but as a corporate executioner, sharpening her blade before the wedding. The silence of the office shattered. First, it was the phones. The landline on her desk, a relic she rarely used, began to trill with a shrill, incessant urgency. Then, the outer office erupted. She could hear her assistants fielding calls, their voices pitching up into frantic, defensive octaves. Through the glass walls, she saw the bullpen transform. Heads popped up over cubicles. People gathered in hushed, terrified clusters, glancing toward her office door like it was the gate to a reactor melting down. Audrey stood up and walked to the window. 42 stories down, the sidewalk was already changing. News vans were double parked on the avenue, satellite dishes extending like angry antennae. A cluster of photographers had gathered near the revolving doors, their lenses trained upward, hunting for a glimpse of the woman who planned to gut a legacy. The betrayal tasted like copper in her mouth. Only 3 people had access to that encrypted drive. The leak had come from inside the fortress. Her cell phone vibrated against the mahogany. The board, the chairman, the investors, the Sterling family. The vibration was a constant, angry buzz that rattled against the wood, demanding an answer she didn't have. For the first time in a decade, Audrey didn't reach for it. She stared at the city, and the city stared back, no longer a grid of lights to be managed, but a jury delivering a verdict. She needed to move. She needed air that wasn't recycled through a building that suddenly felt like it was collapsing. She bypassed the main doors and the terrified stares of her staff, slipping out the side entrance to her private elevator. It was a small, mirrored box reserved for the CEO, designed for efficiency and privacy. Usually, it was her sanctuary, a 30-second decompression chamber between the world and her tower. Today, as the heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing her in, it felt like a coffin. Audrey pressed the button for the garage, her finger leaving a smudge on the polished brass. The car began to descend, a smooth, silent drop that made her stomach lurch. She leaned back against the mirrored wall, closing her eyes, trying to summon the breathing exercises that had carried her through hostile takeovers and market crashes. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. But the air wouldn't go in. Her chest felt banded in iron. A cold sweat pricked at the back of her neck, dampening the collar of her silk blouse. The descent felt too fast, a free fall into the dark. She opened her eyes and saw her reflection in the opposite mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the Iron Sovereign. She was pale, her eyes wide and glassy, a single strand of hair escaping her perfect chignon. And her hands. Audrey looked down. Her hands, clenched at her sides, were shaking. Not a subtle tremor, but a violent, uncontrollable shivering that traveled up her wrists. She tried to make a fist, to force the muscles into submission, but the nerves misfired. She was vibrating with a terrifying, primal fear. The elevator hit the basement level with a soft ding, but the doors didn't open immediately. In that suspended second, the truth hit her harder than the scandal. The leak hadn't just threatened the merger. It had stripped her naked. The narrative of control she had spent 10 years writing was burning, and she was trapped in the smoke. She needed a strategy. She needed a counter-narrative. But as the doors slid open to the gray concrete of the garage, Audrey realized, with a jolt of nausea, that for the first time, the board wasn't the problem. The problem was that she didn't know who she was if she wasn't the one holding the knife. The boardroom and the 42nd floor was usually a cathedral of silence, a place where decisions were made in hushed tones and executed with invisible strokes. Today, it sounded like the floor of the stock exchange 5 minutes before a crash. The crisis management team had assembled in a frantic phalanx around the mahogany table. These were men and women paid exorbitant retainers to spin disaster into gold. But right now, they were spinning nothing but panic. The air was thick with the smell of nervous sweat and the ozone tang of overheating laptops. "We deny the authenticity," Marcus, the VP of Public Relations, was saying, his hands chopping the air. He was sweating through his collar. "We claim it was a fabrication, a disgruntled former employee trying to sabotage the merger. We release a statement within the hour distancing you from the document entirely." Audrey stood at the head of the table, her hands resting on the back of her leather chair. The tremor was gone from her fingers, replaced by a cold, numb dread. She looked at Marcus, watching his mouth move, and realized with terrifying clarity that he was useless. "The document has my digital signature, Marcus," Audrey said, her voice cutting through the babble. "It's time-stamped from my private server. If we lie and they prove it, we don't just lose the merger. We lose the company. I go to prison for fraud." "We can muddy the waters," Marcus insisted, his eyes darting around the room. "We create a counter-narrative. We say, 'You say nothing.'" The voice came from the doorway, low and smoky, dropping into the room like a heavy stone into a shallow pond. Elena Rossi stood there. She hadn't changed clothes. She was still wearing the leather jacket and the combat boots, a jarring visual dissonance against the sea of charcoal suits. She held a cup of coffee in one hand and looked at the room of highly paid consultants with undisguised contempt. "Who is this?" Marcus snapped, turning on his heel. "This is a closed session." Elena ignored him. She walked straight to Audrey, her boots thudding heavily against the plush carpet. She didn't stop until she was standing right beside the CEO, shoulder to shoulder, facing the room. She looked at the giant screen on the far wall, where the grim, pixelated faces of the Sterling Holloway board members were waiting in judgment via secure video link. "You're the acquisitions editor," the Sterling chairman rumbled from the speakers, his voice distorted by the connection. "Ms. Rossi, is it? We are discussing the termination of your CEO. I suggest you leave." "I suggest you listen," Elena shot back. She didn't flinch. She placed her coffee cup on the mahogany table, no coaster, and leaned forward, planting her hands on the wood. "You're angry because you saw a document that looks like a butcher's bill. You think Audrey is planning to gut your legacy." "The memo speaks for itself," the chairman said coldly. "The memo is a stress test," Elena said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a resonance that silenced the PR team. "It's a theoretical model. Audrey ran a simulation of the absolute worst-case financial scenario: total market collapse, print cost spikes, digital failure, to see what it would take to keep the company solvent. That list of cuts? That's not a plan. That's the break glass in case of fire extinguisher." She gestured to Audrey, a sharp, open-handed movement. "You want a CEO who hopes for the best? You want someone who buys your company and crosses her fingers that the market holds? Or do you want the woman who has already stared into the abyss, done the math, and figured out exactly how to keep the lights on when the world burns down?" The room went dead silent. Marcus's mouth was hanging slightly open. Elena didn't let up. She looked directly into the camera lens, her gaze fierce and protective. Audrey Stevens didn't build this empire by being nice. She built it by being prepared. That memo proves she cares more about the survival of this company than she cares about being liked. And frankly, if I were investing $1 billion, that's the only kind of person I'd trust with my money. Audrey stood perfectly still, her breath caught in her throat. For 10 years, she had been the shield. She was the one who stood in front of the board, the one who absorbed the blows, the one who translated chaos into strategy. She had never, not once, had someone stand in front of her. She looked at Elena's profile. She saw the tension in Elena's jaw, the fierce set of her brow, the way her hands gripped the edge of the table, white-knuckled, ready to fight. It was a physical sensation, sudden and overwhelming, like a heavy cloak being draped over her shivering shoulders. She was being protected. The chairman on the screen cleared his throat. The sound was loud in the quiet room. He looked down at his notes, then back up at the camera. His expression had shifted from fury to a grudging, calculating respect. "A stress test," the chairman muttered. He looked at Audrey. "Is that accurate, Miss Stevens?" Audrey looked at Elena. Elena didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the screen, holding the line, her presence a solid, unmoving anchor in the storm. "Yes," Audrey said, her voice steady, drawing strength from the heat radiating off the woman beside her. "It is." "Then get us a press release that explains that," the chairman said. "And, Miss Stevens, don't let a draft like that leave your server again." The screen went black. The connection ended. The storm raged outside, rain lashing against the glass, but the center of the room had gone quiet. Audrey looked at Elena, and for the first time, she didn't see an employee or a variable. She saw the only person in the world who had seen the knife in her hand and understood that she was trying to save the patient, not kill him. The exodus was slow, then sudden. Once the press release had been drafted, redrafted, and finally approved by legal, the crisis management team packed up their briefcases with the hurried efficiency of paramedics leaving a stabilized scene. They offered stiff nods and murmured reassurances, fleeing the tension of the penthouse for the safety of their town cars waiting in the garage below. By 2:45 a.m., the heavy oak doors clicked shut for the final time, sealing the room. The silence that followed was different from the silence Audrey had cultivated for years. Her silence had been a vacuum, a void created by the exclusion of life. This silence was heavy, textured, and exhausted. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the smoke clears, where the only sound left is the ringing in your ears. Audrey remained standing at the head of the table. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the ambush, the panic, and the defense was beginning to metabolize into a leaden fatigue. Her body, usually a finely tuned instrument of corporate will, felt heavy and foreign. The muscles in her lower back throbbed in time with the pulse in her temples. She felt brittle, as if a strong gust of wind, or a kind word, might shatter her into 1,000 pieces of tailored charcoal wool. She stared at the blank screen where the Sterling board had been. The reflection in the black glass showed a woman who was still standing, but only just. Sit. The word was soft, dropping into the quiet like a feather. Audrey turned. She had almost forgotten Elena was there. Elena, who hadn't packed up. Elena, who was currently moving around the periphery of the room, not leaving, but changing the environment. "I have to review the final copy," Audrey said, though her voice lacked its usual steel. It sounded thin, frayed at the edges. "The copy is fine. Sit down, Audrey, before you fall down." Elena walked over to the wall panel near the door. With a decisive click, she killed the overhead fluorescent banks. The aggressive interrogation room glare vanished instantly, replaced by the soft, ambient glow of the city bleeding in through the floor-to-ceiling windows and the singular, warm pool of light from the table lamp. The visual relief was so immediate that Audrey actually let out a long, shaky breath. The room felt smaller now, intimate. The shadows softened the hard edges of the mahogany and the glass, turning the boardroom into something that felt less like an arena and more like a shelter. Audrey sank into her leather chair. She didn't perch on the edge as she usually did, ready to spring into action. She collapsed back, letting the spine of the chair take her weight. She closed her eyes for a second, just a second, and the darkness behind her lids spun dizzily. A sound made her open them, the thud of heavy boots on carpet. Elena was pulling a chair around, not to the opposite side of the table, but right next to her, close enough to invade the personal space that Audrey guarded like a national border. "Here." Elena placed a glass of water on the table. It wasn't one of the crystal tumblers from the sideboard. It was a simple paper cup from the cooler in the hallway. The cardboard was soft with condensation. Audrey stared at it. "I'm not thirsty." "You haven't had water in 6 hours. You've had 3 espressos and a panic attack. Drink." Audrey reached for the cup. Her hand felt heavy, disconnected from her brain. As she lifted it, she realized her fingers were stiff. She took a sip. The water was shockingly cold, a sharp, clean shock to her system that washed away the taste of stale coffee and fear. She drank the rest in one long draught, the coolness trailing down her throat, grounding her. When she set the cup down, she realized Elena was watching her. Not with the defiant challenge of the morning, nor the fierce protectiveness of the afternoon. She was watching with a quiet, clinical observation that felt unnervingly personal. Elena's eyes tracked the tension in Audrey's shoulders, the way Audrey's hand lingered on the paper cup. "You're still wearing the armor," Elena murmured. Audrey frowned, touching the lapel of her blazer. "I beg your pardon?" "The shoes," Elena said, nodding toward the floor. "You've been standing in 3-inch heels for 14 hours. Take them off." "I am in a place of business, Elena. I'm not going to—" "The business is closed," Elena interrupted gently. "The board is asleep. The crisis team is gone. It's just us. And if you don't take them off, your arches are going to spasm before we even get to the parking garage." Audrey looked down at her feet. They were throbbing, a dull, rhythmic pain she had trained herself to ignore since she was 22. It was part of the uniform, part of the discipline. But tonight, in the dim light, with the rain streaking the glass and Elena's dark eyes waiting, the discipline felt heavy, useless. Slowly, defiantly, Audrey reached down. She unhooked the strap of her left stiletto and let it drop. Then the right. The sensation of her stockinged feet hitting the plush carpet was a shock of comfort so intense it was almost obscene. The release of tension shot up her calves, and her shoulders dropped 2 inches. It was a physical undoing. Without the height, without the steel shanks under her heels, she felt shorter, smaller, human. She looked up, feeling strangely exposed. Elena wasn't gloating. She was just nodding, a small, tired smile playing on her lips. She reached out, not to touch Audrey, but to the lamp on the table, angling the shade away so the light wasn't hitting Audrey's eyes directly. It was a small gesture, a shifting of light. But to Audrey, who had spent a decade anticipating blows, the act of care felt violent in its gentleness. She didn't know how to defend against it. She didn't know how to parry a glass of water or a dimmed light. "Better?" Elena asked softly. Audrey nodded, unable to trust her voice. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the hum of the city and the terrified, electric realization that the Iron Sovereign had left the building, leaving only a tired woman in the dark with the one person who had seen her break. Exhaustion has a way of stripping the truth down to the bone, eroding the filters we spend our lives perfecting. And as the clock ticked toward 3:15 a.m., Audrey realized she was too tired to lie. The silence that followed wasn't the empty, hollow quiet of the office before midnight. It was a dense, vibrating thing, filled with the debris of everything they had just stripped away. The press release sat on the table between them, a finished artifact of the crisis, but it felt irrelevant now. The real work, the dismantling of the fortress Audrey had spent a decade building, had happened in the spaces between the words. Audrey sat frozen, her hands resting loosely in her lap, feeling a strange, terrifying lightness. She had admitted it. She had said the words out loud, the loneliness, the fear, the exhaustion of holding up the sky. And the sky hadn't fallen. Elena hadn't laughed. She hadn't used the information as leverage. She had just listened, her dark eyes absorbing the confession without judgment, acting as the only safe harbor in a city of sharks. But now the words were gone, and the physical reality of the room rushed back in. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchenette, the distant wail of a siren on Wacker Drive, the sound of Elena's breathing, steady and close. Elena pushed her chair back. The scrape of the wheels against the carpet was a harsh, definitive sound. She stood up, stretching her arms overhead, the leather of her jacket groaning softly. "It's done," Elena said quietly. Her voice was rough with fatigue. "The narrative is set. You survive." Audrey looked up at her. The moment Elena stood, the distance returned. The warmth of her body, which had been a radiant heat source next to Audrey's arm for the last hour, pulled away. A sudden, irrational panic spiked in Audrey's chest. The crisis was over. The variable was leaving. The equation would reset to zero, cold, efficient, and alone. "Yes," Audrey managed to say. "I survive." Elena nodded. She gathered her phone and her empty coffee cup. She took a step toward the door, then another. Audrey watched her go. This was the protocol. This was how it worked. People came in, they served a function, and they left. Audrey stayed. She was the structure, not the inhabitant. But then, Elena stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She stood there, halfway between the table and the heavy oak doors, her head bowed slightly. The tension in the room, which had been ebbing, suddenly snapped taut, like a violin string tightened to the breaking point. Elena turned. She didn't look at the door. She looked at Audrey. Her expression was unreadable, not the brash confidence of the editor, nor the fierce protector of the boardroom. It was open, searching. She walked back. She didn't rush. Her boots made no sound on the plush carpet this time. She moved with a deliberate, predatory grace, closing the gap until she was standing right in front of Audrey's chair. She was close enough that Audrey could smell the faint, lingering scent of the rain she'd brought in hours ago, mixed with the sharpness of coffee and something warm and uniquely her. Audrey stopped breathing. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She should stand up. She should reassert her authority. She should say, "Good night, Ms. Rossi." She didn't move. Elena reached out. It wasn't a grab. It wasn't a demand. It was a question, asked in slow motion. Her hand, ink-stained at the knuckle and steady as stone, moved through the space between them. Audrey watched it come, paralyzed by a terrifying cocktail of instinct. The instinct to flinch, to retreat, to deflect, and a desperate, starving need to be touched. Elena's fingers grazed Audrey's jawline. The sensation was electric. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a physical shock that jolted through Audrey's nervous system, bypassing logic entirely. Her skin, starved of contact for so long that it had forgotten the language of touch, flared hot under Elena's fingertips. Elena's hand settled there, cupping Audrey's cheek, her thumb resting lightly against the corner of Audrey's mouth. Her palm was warm, rough with calluses from turning pages and holding pens, and it felt heavier than the weight of the entire merger. "You don't have to be the fortress tonight," Elena whispered. Her voice was low, intimate, vibrating in the small space between them. "The gates are open, Audrey. You can just be." Audrey stared up into Elena's eyes, seeing her own reflection in the dark irises. Not the Iron Sovereign, but a woman with wide eyes and parted lips, trembling in the dark. The contact was overwhelming. It was terrifying to be known this well, to be seen without the armor. Every instinct Audrey had honed over 10 years screamed at her to pull back, to freeze over, to protect the asset. But the heat of Elena's hand was an anchor. It grounded her in the present, in the body she had treated like a machine for so long. Audrey's breath hitched. A shudder ran through her, visible and undeniable. She felt the last brick of the wall give way. She didn't pull back. Slowly, terrifyingly, Audrey leaned in. She pressed her cheek into Elena's palm, closing her eyes, surrendering the weight of her head to the strength of Elena's hand. It was a gesture of absolute defeat and absolute victory. The merger was saved, the company was secure, and the crisis was averted. But as she felt Elena's thumb brush softly against her skin, Audrey knew the truth. The Iron Sovereign was gone, and Audrey was lost. The sun that rose over Chicago the next morning didn't look like an interrogation lamp anymore. It looked like a spotlight. The press conference was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the glass-walled atrium. The flashbulbs popped in a rhythmic staccato, a chaotic visual drumbeat that usually made Audrey grit her teeth behind her smile, bracing for impact. Today, she didn't grit anything. She stood at the podium, the microphone cool against her hand, and delivered the narrative they had built together in the dark. She spoke of the stress test memo, not as a mistake, but as the necessary, grim calculation of a responsible leader. She owned the ruthlessness, but she framed it as protection. The journalists, usually hungry for blood, found themselves chewing on iron instead. They scribbled furiously, nodding, turning the narrative from CEO plans massacre to CEO prepares for war. It was a masterclass in spin, but for the first time in her career, the words didn't feel hollow. They felt anchored, because at the very back of the room, leaning against a marble pillar with her arms crossed over that same battered leather jacket, was Elena. Elena didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply watched, her dark eyes tracking Audrey across the stage with a steady, grounding gravity. In the past, Audrey would have scanned the room for threats, a frowning investor, a skeptical reporter, a loose thread in the tapestry of control. Today, her eyes sought out the pillar. Every time she felt the old, cold armor trying to lock into place, she looked at Elena, and she remembered the heat of a hand against her jaw. She remembered the terrified relief of surrendering the weight of her head. It was a secret language established in the silence of 3 a.m., spoken now across a room full of noise. It was a tether of invisible wire connecting the podium to the pillar, a constant signal cutting through the static, keeping Audrey from floating away into the vacuum of her own perfection. When the conference ended, the board members, the ones who had been ready to execute her via video link 12 hours ago, were waiting to shake her hand. They praised her composure. They lauded her foresight. They clapped her on the shoulder, mistaking her calm for the usual icy detachment. They had no idea that the woman shaking their hands wasn't the Iron Sovereign anymore. The fortress was still standing, yes, but the gates were unlocked. The lights were on inside. Audrey moved through the crowd, the sea of gray suits parting for her as usual. But the air around her felt different. It wasn't the sterile silence of space anymore. It was charged, alive. She caught Elena's eye as she passed the periphery of the scrum. Elena didn't move, but the corner of her mouth quirked up, a tiny, private acknowledgement that hit Audrey harder than the applause. It was a look that said, "I see you." And for once, the exposure didn't burn. Audrey realized then that her calculations had been wrong for a decade. She had treated intimacy as a structural weakness, a crack in the foundation that would bring the tower down. She had been terrified that needing someone would make her soft, that desire was a liability on the balance sheet. But as she walked back toward the elevators, feeling the ghost of Elena's touch still lingering on her skin, she felt stronger than she ever had in isolation. The ice kept things preserved, perfectly frozen in time. It was safe, immaculate, and entirely predictable. But it was dead. Fire? Fire forged steel. Fire drove the engine. She had spent years building an empire of cold perfection, terrified of the heat, only to find that she didn't just survive the fire. She preferred it. Later, the heavy oak door of the executive suite clicked shut. But this time, it wasn't locking the world out. It was keeping the warmth in. Audrey Stevens was still the CEO, still the architect, but she was no longer untouchable. And looking at Elena across the desk, she knew she never wanted to be again. If you've ever found strength in letting your guard down, subscribe to Sapphic Legacy for more stories about the power of intimacy.